Hi guys! So I just finished my Glitterature on Bloodlines, and if you watch that Glitterature, you can tell that I am really hyper right now. So I figured I would just go ahead and film another Glitterature. This one's on the Red Queen, and I finished this one recently too, so I knew I was going to film a Glitterature eventually, but I don't know when I'm going to have time to put this up because I'm putting up a lot of October themed videos, but I'll film it and have it for you guys, so when you see it, this was filmed the same night that I filmed this one, and I still have my little skull earrings on, and they have little bows. They're like girls' skulls. If I was to be a skull or a skeleton, I would want to be rhinestoney with a bow. The White Queen and the Red Queen are parallel storylines talking about these rival queens-to-be slash rival mothers of future kings. And so the White Queen is on one side, the Red Queen is on the other, and they have this power struggle for basically the entire lifespan of the two women in question, the Red Queen and the White Queen. So there's also a third book that's not out yet. It might be out now by the time I put this video up, but as of filming it, it wasn't up 2 weeks ago and it said pre-order only, and I haven't checked since then. So because I was loving this book so much, I was like, I want to go ahead and have the next one so that I don't like feel bad for finishing this one, because when I get really into a book I do that. But lately I've been getting so into every single book I'm reading, it's crazy. Like every Glitterature I've done lately have been raving about the books, and I don't love every book I read, but lately I've just been picking good ones, I guess. This takes place back in 1453 is when it starts, and it goes through her lifespan. She's basically the heiress to the House of Lancaster. Now, there was this huge feud between the House of Lancaster and the House of York. And if you read The White Queen, it's all about, they're all like the York side. And they basically like have a lot of wars and have a lot of battles. What it comes down to is that the Lancaster house was the true house. I don't remember the exact history. I took a European history class in college, but basically like there was a king or something, and then the direct heir would have been the House of Lancaster. But what happened was, I guess he was ill or something, and so the House of York came in, who was a claim to the throne, but not the direct line. And back then it was all about direct line or fight to the death. And so they came in and basically had this huge war, and they won. And so it went back and forth. They struggled, and that book was really interesting, The White Queen, because, and if you watch the Glitterature, I'll link it below because they're kind of connected. They happen at the same time. The story of the Princes in the Tower, which I was always like really fascinated by that story about the two young boys that basically disappeared, and no one knows who murdered them, no one knows where they went, but they were the heirs to the House of York. They were the princes, and it would have changed the entire course of history if they hadn't been murdered. So it's just kind of like, it was one of those stories that always really got me, and that was what that book was about. So that's why I read that book. And then I read this one because I liked The White Queen so much. Without going into like tons of details, these books are basically historical fiction. So they're based on facts. All the dates and the names and the stories are right, but the author definitely has liberty to embellish all the stories. We don't know all the details about what happened in England in 1400s, but it's really interesting. I love the way this author writes. I've read a ton of her books. She wrote The Other Boleyn Girl, which I loved. I didn't really like the movie, but I loved the book. So I'm going through slowly and reading every single one of her books because I really like them. But The White Queen was one of my favorite ones I've read from her. And when I read that one, I thought to myself that there's no way I could ever be on the Red Queen's side, because the White Queen was like a really nice person, and she was beautiful, and she was loved, and she loved her children, and she was a kind woman, and she was a commoner that the king like fell in love with, and they had this affectionate, true love, passionate relationship. It was like the fairy tale. Like they were known for being like truly in love, which was unheard of back then because it was all arranged marriages and marriages for power. This lady was the total opposite. I felt so bad for her in this book. I didn't like this book as much as The White Queen, but mainly it's because it's so depressing, and also I'm not on her side. I totally wanted the York side to win, even though she has a great claim and everything. I just felt like in the end the York Queen was just nicer. The White Queen was just like a nicer person. But this lady she has a hard life. There was this scene at the beginning of the book where she's 12 years old and she's married off to a man much older than her. She's 12, and she gets pregnant pretty immediately after their wedding, and she basically is giving birth to a baby boy when she is like 12 or 13 years old, and the baby's too big for her. And the way they describe the birth is awful. Like, the author, I think, did a lot of research on what the birthing process was back then, like what the I guess like the old wives' tales and like the things that they would do that they thought would help, and it just sounded like the most awful thing that she's ever, like, I can't imagine if women had to like go through what she went through every day. But she has one baby, one boy that becomes her life. Like, she actually doesn't even get to see him. He gets taken away from her, but like she doesn't get to see him grow up because he's the heir to the Lancaster throne, and so he's basically like, he has to leave the country. But she has a really hard life. She can't have any more kids because the first birth was so bad it like messed her up, so she can't have any more kids. And she gets married a couple times, she gets widowed a couple times, she doesn't ever fall in love, she doesn't really ever have anything that good happen to her. But at the end of the book, there is a nice connection that happens between the White Queen and the Red Queen, and I like the way it ends. But and it's crazy that this was like the people before like Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, because that just like throws me off. Like, that's so crazy how they're all related. Duh, they're all English royalty. But in my mind, I'm just like, oh, like making all these connections. I really like European history. But overall, there's a lot of details in this book. It's hard for me to like pinpoint what's important to tell you guys. Overall, I liked it. I didn't like it as much as the White Queen. I think that the White Queen was a more fun story to read, not only because she had a better story and she had lots and lots of kids that she loved, that she got to keep with her and all this stuff. The Princess in the Tower, that was sad, but for the most part she has a pretty good life, so it's fun to read. But also there's this entire like underlining storyline in the White Queen where I talk about this in the literature, but every couple chapters there's like this little part of like an old fairy tale about the water goddess that they're apparently related to, and it kind of like weaves through the story, and it's just really like, it's like reading an old fairy tale, whereas this one was more like reading a fiction novel. And I just didn't bond with the character. I didn't bond with Margaret. I didn't feel like she was a likable character. But I think the author did a good job making her as likable as they could for what her character was. I don't think she was a likable person. In real life, she just historically was a very sour woman. So, I mean, there's only so much you can do when you're working with history and trying to make it into a storyline. But overall, if you liked the White Queen, I would recommend reading the Red Queen. I did go through it really quickly. I don't regret reading it. Like, I wasn't bored. I just wasn't as in love with it as I was with the White Queen. But I think if you read The White Queen, you really like it. It's nice to see the other point of view and see what else was going on in the kingdom. And then you can read the third book, which is bound to be really good if it's about the White Queen's mother, who was like directly related to the water goddess that it talks about all in The White Queen or something. And I just think that will be really interesting. So I can't wait for that one to come out. But that was my 2 cents on this book. I recommend reading it if you like The White Queen, but I would definitely start with The White Queen and see if you're even into this type of story, because I think it's a very like, I don't think it's the type of story that everyone would like. I think it's a very like particular group of taste that this type of book would cater to, and I happen to be like really passionate about European history and stuff, so I like it. But I don't know, a lot of people I feel like would feel like they were like being forced to read a book in school. Like, it's very like historical. That was all. I'm rambling again, so I'm gonna let you guys go, but let me know what you think about the White Queen, Red Queen in the comments below, and I'll see you guys later. Bye.